I'm Amira, and this is the Politics of Bits. Today, we have Kim Donovan. Kim's now at the Atlantic Council, but before that, she served in the U.S. federal government for 15 years. Most recently as Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor at FinCEN, also known as the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Kim's got extensive experience in how the U.S. government uses tools like sanctions to fight terrorism and money laundering, a topic that's drawn increasing interest from the tech and crypto community. I asked Kim to join us as someone who can offer insight into what's actually happening within the walls of the U.S. Treasury, particularly ahead of decisions to sanction or debank. And as someone who can offer a fair analysis of what the U.S. government is doing right and what it could be doing better when it comes to economic statecraft. Kim, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Amira. Thanks for having me.
So let's just start off with a bit of background and grounding so that people understand where you're coming from here. Can you tell us a little bit about FinCEN and what FinCEN's role is?
Sure. So as you noted, FinCEN is a financial crimes enforcement network. It's a bureau within the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and it is the primary regulator for the United States government for the Bank Secrecy Act. That means all of the anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism regulations, and they're also the financial intelligence unit for the United States, which means that they collect BSA information, Bank Secrecy Act information from financial institutions, identifying suspicious activity as well as currency movements and transaction flows.
So all that information that banks submit and have to collect when it comes to Bank Secrecy Act, that is what they forward that, or they forward what they flagged onto FinCEN, and FinCEN reviews it.
Yep, FinCEN reviews it, and then if there's something of note in that information, then they work closely with law enforcement to identify different suspicious activity that might lead to illicit finance.
So I think there's a lot of activity that is either central to FinCEN or on the adjacencies of FinCEN that I think's of huge interest to the crypto audience. And it's a lot because I think a lot of the reason crypto exists in the first place is in response to this idea that the global financial rails are exclusive or exclude some types of people, right? And one of the key places where this happens is in sanctions, right? Through the sanctions regime. And so it'd be great if you talk to me a little bit about like what the role of sanctions are in U.S. economic statecraft, why they exist, and then how do sanctions decisions get made?
Sure. So sanctions, there's a couple different types of sanctions, but the ones that I think folks are most familiar with these days are what would be called financial designations. And examples of that are sanctions that have been put on Iran or Russia to limit Russia's invasion of Ukraine and ability to generate revenue. So these types of sanctions, it's a tool that OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Assets Control within the Treasury Department, they're the primary authority for issuing these types of financial sanctions. These sanctions are really a foreign policy tool, and they are intended to change an adversary's behavior. So the concept is if you levy these sanctions and cut them off from the U.S. financial system, that will compel the adversary to change their behavior and stop doing whatever bad activity we don't like, with the goal of trying to get those sanctions then removed.
So let's dive in, because I think there's a lot of nuance into sort of how sanctions are being applied, their increasing role in U.S. foreign policy. And one of them is that there's this perception that sanctions activity or the designation of folks has really increased dramatically in the last few years. And I have some stats here. So one is that the United States added about 2,500 persons, and that includes entities and individuals, to the SCN list in 2023. That's up about 10% from 2022. And then on average, the U.S. sanctioned an average of 815 people annually between 2017 and 2021. So, we go from about 800 people to about 2,500 folks a year in the span of a few years. Most of these organizations or individuals are Russia-related, but not all of them. We saw human rights and corruption-related sanctions increase 90% from 2022 to 2023. Give us a sense of why you think sanctions activity has increased so much in the past few years.
Sure. So it's a great question. And there's kind of like two sides to it from my perspective. So I think, the sanctions, especially the increase of sanctions over the past couple of years, really reflects the U.S. government's national security priorities. So as you can see, it's significant portion of these sanctions that have kind of been put in place during the Biden administration, they're focused on Russia. There's also a bunch on Venezuela, as well as human rights and anti-corruption. So I think it's also interesting with the anti-corruption point is that when the Biden administration came in, they actually stood up an office within the National Security Council focused on anti-corruption and how they could use the range of whole U.S. government tools to combat this activity, and sanctions, especially with the global Magnitsky style sanctions, which was a piece of legislation passed by Congress several years ago to allow the U.S. government to sanction human rights abusers as well as corrupt officials in foreign governments. That's when you saw over the past couple of years where those sanctions have really come online. I think the other point with this is that sanctions really find themselves in that sweet spot of foreign policy and national security tools. They are more than diplomacy, but they are less than military engagement. So they're seen to pack a huge punch against an adversary, but it's not that we're necessarily going to war with them. It sends a very strong signal. It can reduce and disrupt their activity, but we're not firing missiles, say, into Russia. So, I think the use of sanctions over the past few years is really acknowledgement that these are very important and strong tools, and that we were not prepared to go to war with Russia, and so we've decided to use economic statecraft, notably sanctions, as well as export controls, and a few other different economic tools with regards to Russia.
So let's take a look at one example that I think has stirred a lot of interest in the crypto community, which is the designation of tornado cash in 2022. So that's an example where you don't just see an increase in the number of designates. It's designation of sort of an entirely different type of thing. It's not an individual, it's not an entity, it's a protocol. And I think a lot of people in the crypto community were frustrated by this designation because they see it as an attack on the creation of open source software and not just on individuals and their activity. So how do you square the circle here? Like, what do you think is going on inside Treasury when making a decision like designating a protocol?
Yeah, so that was a really big decision, and Tornado Cash was a huge action. When OFAC in particular is putting together these different sanction packages, there's a very high legal threshold that they have to meet that's called an evidentiary. And so they have to identify enough information and evidence to show that the individual or entity that's being sanctioned actually warrants that sanction. And with the case with Tornado Cash, not FinCEN, but OFAC was able to identify enough illicit activity that was flowing through Tornado Cash that it met the legal threshold to designate the entirety of the protocol. After the fact, I think there's been recognition that a lot of potentially innocent people's kind of finances and assets were caught up in that action, and that's also why OFAC provides a lot of guidance and information on how individuals can petition against the different sanctions and try to get access to their assets if they've been caught up in a sanction.
So let's and I don't mean to ask you to defend sort of all of the facts, but let's dig into this a little more. A few of those pieces I think will raise some hackles, right? So one is this idea that enough illicit activity was flowing through Tornado Cash to designate the entire protocol. I think you see the argument that we made is that any system where there's a ton of money flowing through will have a percentage of it be based on illicit activity, right? Ideally, it's a smaller percentage rather than a larger percentage. But if you think about art dealing, any sort of large movement of money around the world, you're going to see illicit activity, but we don't sanction sort of those entire movements. And so when you think about what actually meets a threshold where it's worthwhile to look at a particular protocol, how do you square that idea of meeting a threshold of illicit activity with protection of people's rights, in this case, sort of their ability to access their finances?
Sure. I think with these different types of protocols, it's also really important that they demonstrate that they have sound AML CFT compliance measures, right? So of course there's illicit activity that flows through the financial system in different sectors. I think even NASDAQ reported earlier this year that over $3 trillion of illicit finance flowed through the global financial system in 2023. It's a ton of money. And that's what we've been able to identify. So it's not to say that there isn't activity that's going through other sectors. I think with a situation like tornado cash, it's really important that these different types of protocols, ensure that they have the compliance checks in place to demonstrate that they're trying to prevent illicit actors from leveraging their network and their services. And I can't go into specific details on this case because I didn't work on it, but I have to trust that the OFAC lawyers they are very, very difficult to get by. And so they clearly saw that there was enough information to think that it would be appropriate to designate the entirety of tornado cash.
So then let's talk about the sort of deleterious impacts on the other side, right? Because as you said, there's a lot of people who are innocent who got sort of caught up in this designation, including a bunch of people whose wallets have been dusted by people who used tornado cash just to make sure that the impact was as far and disparate as possible. So how does internally the weighing of what the sort of deleterious impacts of a designation line up or get baked into a decision to designate, and how much confidence you have that there's someone out there thinking about what might happen on the other side of a designation, especially in this case where you're dealing in sort of new territory. Designating a protocol, I think, is novel activity.
Yeah. So yeah, this was the first, especially with tornado cash. That was the first time OFAC had taken an action like that before. So I think a lot of it, it was a bit of, I don't want to say let's see what happens, because this is something that had been deliberated quite a bit across the Treasury Department. But it is something that everyone takes very serious. And the Treasury Department has put out a lot of information about financial inclusion and wanting to make sure that banks are de-risking themselves of specific types of clients. So it is something that's taken into consideration, but they also are put in a position where they have to weigh the benefits and risks of taking different actions. And with the situation with tornado cash, there was enough information that warranted designating the entirety of the protocol, recognizing how these different bad actors and multiple different types of bad actors were using this specific platform.
So how do we think about the role of sanctions in U.S. economic policy more broadly, and whether or not it's gone too far? Because I think I have a lot of colleagues who would say, you shut a lot of people out of their ability to legally access their money, who had no idea. And while there is guidance and talking points available for people who are on the other side of this, it is pretty difficult, right? No matter how much guidance you might offer, people want access to their funds in real time. And the reality is any sort of appeal from OFAC, I think, takes at least months. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. It takes months. I mean, ultimately, you probably need to find a lawyer. It's expensive. But I think one of the things that we're actually trying to do within my program at the Atlantic Council is call out the need for a better understanding of the economic impact of sanctions. Over the past several years, as you noted before, there's just been a huge increase in how the U.S. government in particular has been using sanctions. We've also been encouraging our foreign partners in Europe and the UK to levy sanctions. And frankly, I don't think we have done a good enough job of truly understanding the economic impact that these sanctions ultimately have on individuals, as well as the broader global financial system. And so, I know it's something that Treasury is focused on. They've created a new office and have a chief economist for sanctions, but it's a work in progress, and it's something that they need to continue to focus on to ensure that there is some level of understanding of what is the true impact of these actions and not just take an action for the sake of a press release.
So let's talk. Let's talk about debanking, which is another issue that's of interest to I think the crypto community. Did you oversee debanking as part of your role at FinCEN? Was that something in scope of what you worked on?
No, it's not necessarily like a portfolio.
So let's talk about what it is and what that actually looks like. Because I think on the outside, what folks see is a coordinated campaign to debank certain individuals, but I think on the inside, what's actually happening is a little more complex and more disjointed. Maybe we could start with Operation Chokepoint 2.0, and there's some history here. There was an original Operation Chokepoint in 2013. What did that look like? Because that is a well-documented effort, the OG Operation Chokepoint.
Yeah. So OG Operation Chokepoint, it is a well-documented effort that was, in conjunction with DOJ as well as several other financial regulators. And it initially had started as a mini task force to try to prevent fraud. And the whole purpose of it was to identify specific industries that may be at higher risk of money laundering or financial fraud, and alerting banks to that activity so that they can be on the lookout in terms of how they're assessing their own risks and what types of customers they're willing to do business with. And this goes way back to, the whole way that the US and global financial system operates is on a risk-based approach. So financial institutions take it upon themselves to kind of better understand how much risk they're willing to accept when taking on different types of clients, and what are they kind of investing in, and just trying to manage and mitigate their risk in different decisions. So with Operation Chokepoint, while there were a couple actual enforcement actions that came out of it, especially as it related to like some payday loan providers, it really was more on this kind of helping banks identify different industries that may be considered higher risk. So they needed to pay a bit more attention to them when making decisions on whether or not to bank them.
So let's fast forward now to what is sort of known as Operation Chokepoint 2.0. So many in the tech industry believe that there's been a coordinated effort to restrict crypto and the industry's access to traditional banking services. So Mark Andreessen has said that he has 30 portfolio companies where either the companies or the founders themselves have found their access to banking services restricted. What do you think is actually going on here? Why do you think people are seeing an Operation Chokepoint 2.0? And do you think there actually is one happening within the government?
So I think I'll start first. I don't think it's necessarily happening in a coordinated fashion. I think that almost gives the U.S. government and all the different banking regulators too much credit for how coordinated they can be sometimes. But there are very valid concerns, and a lot of folks have been debanked. But I do think that the coordinated approach may be exaggerated. I think there's been a lot of concern over the cryptocurrency world and just how these different platforms can be leveraged by illicit actors for several years, right? I mean, I think it's really important to remember that in Trump's first term, he was very anti-crypto. And his former Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, actually came out and said that crypto posed a national security threat. And this was all around the time that Facebook was standing up Libra. And, we know Libra doesn't exist anymore. So, these are kind of long-standing things that have gone into banking, the banking sector's kind of risk calculus and how they're determining what types of clients to work with or invest in. I think in the Biden administration, especially coming out of the Trump administration's decisions with regard to crypto, I think the Biden administration has been actually trying to work with the crypto industry to, put out the regulatory clarity that has been requested in how this space should be operating But I also can see the point where some of their actions have probably been a little too heavy-handed, and where there's been a lot of situations where they've probably used, regulation through enforcement. So at some point, I think there has to be a balance achieved between what the crypto industry is needing and wanting, and versus what the regulators' expectations are of this entire sector.
Let's take these two issues separately in my mind, right? So I think on one hand, there's these issues around how should we think about regulation of crypto as an industry when it comes to issuance of stablecoins, how you classify tokens. Those are specific regulatory problems that, there's a debate in the Biden administration about whether or not you should use regulation by enforcement or support legislation or some combination of the two. Yeah, there's a separate issue which is this idea that if you are operating in this industry, you're going to have trouble getting access to banking services. And to me, that's entirely different, right? That's not as the SEC coming after you. That is, hey, I'm operating this company that has been vetted by top tier investors, that has actual customers, and I can't get access to basic banking to just run my balance sheet, run my payroll. How does that happen? Because if it's not a coordinated by the U.S. government, a coordinated effort by the U.S. government, it sure seems to people like that on the other side.
Well, I think it comes down to the bank's decision, right? So I know there's a lot of focus on a coordinated effort that the U.S. government is moving forward with, but while I think FinCEN or other regulators have done a pretty good job of indicating and identifying different risks that are out there with, whether it's with crypto or other, trends and typologies in other sectors, it really does come down to the banks and how much are they willing to, how much risk are they willing to accept with different customers and clients. And I think right now, they're seeing what happened with, SVB, Silvergate, that kind of thing. So they may be just a little bit more kind of risk adverse in terms of working with some of these clients, not all, but some. But I think it's also kind of interesting space right now because I think a lot of these financial institutions also see crypto as a competitor. So you also have to kind of think about, in a future state of however the next administration decides to regulate or deregulate the sector, banks are kind of just waiting to get in and to play in this space themselves. So I think there's also kind of the angle where some of these crypto clients just also maybe competitors for these banks, and maybe that's also kind of going into their decision calculus.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's certainly a competitiveness angle where banking doesn't want to see crypto thrive because of the competitive threat. But then there's this big sort of like de-risking angle of it. And maybe my question is, to what extent does Treasury or the broader government have an obligation or interest in promoting this idea that banks should be open to providing banking services to risky startups? For the sake of promotion of innovation versus sort of the banks making their own personal risk calculuses. Because what's happening, I think, is banks are making these risk calculi, and it's having a lot of disparate impact because the revenue that you might earn from smaller startups that have crypto attached to them is not necessarily worth the potential risk you might get from the perceived impact that you're going to get hit with a sanction or some other kind of enforcement action from the U.S. government. And it feels like there's work that could be done around clarification there, providing some kind of openness or leash to banks that are providing services to smaller companies.
No, I agree. I think that some level of guidance would be really helpful, at least to kind of give some comfort to banks that this is an area that no one's going to get dinged on the head for engaging in. But even more than that, I think that there's just kind of internal bureaucratic challenges across the U.S. government that need to be figured out in this space as well. And that is, more coordination among the banking regulators to make sure that they're all kind of looking at these issues the same way, and further on the examination front, because that's what banks are really concerned about. They don't want a bank examiner to come in and, open up all of their records and then, audit them and go down enforcement angles or fines and that type of thing. So I think that there needs to be just greater, not only guidance to the banks, maybe to explain that, they're not going to be like this is an area that it's okay to work in, but it's also, I think, incumbent on the US government to make sure that the regulators are talking about this together and coming to the same conclusions, and that the regulators and examiners are on the same page, because I think that disconnect is what is causing a lot of the consternation and concern.
What incentives could you provide to banks to be more risk tolerant in these contexts?
Well, I think banks would really like to have some level of comfort that this space is okay to operate in. I'm not exactly sure what type of like inducements or anything that you'd want to give to a bank in this space per se, but I think that there could be some level of guidance or comfort provided by the Treasury or the regulators about liquidity and how much what is that liquidity based on, and is it how does that play into taking on these different types of customers?
Like the bank's liquidity.
Like the bank's liquidity. Because if
Got it.
So, like,
Go ahead.
If one of these, hypothetically, if a crypto firm that was banked kind of went belly up, and then just trying to actually figure out like what was the total asset value there, and then does the bank have enough liquidity to finance that?
I see. So part of the issue here is that because the nature of the assets of crypto companies is so non-traditional, that risk models to help assess what happens in the case of like company failure just don't adapt, and banks don't have much of an opportunity or reason to really figure out how to navigate through that.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay. Can we talk a little bit about sort of specific examples of debanking as a policy tool? Because I think this is an adjacency, but I think, one example that people often bring into this conversation is targeted debanking of individuals. The famous example of this is the Canadian truckers a few years ago, where, during protests of Canadian truckers, the federal government reportedly froze bank accounts linked to individuals supporting the movement. What are your thoughts on individual debanking as a policy tool, and how often it is used or how often it should be used?
So, the U.S. government doesn't use debanking necessarily as a policy tool. Sanction is definitely a policy tool, and debanking can come with sanctions, right? So if someone's put on the SDN list, their bank would freeze their assets and they won't have access to them. So, there's a level of debanking there. Sanctions, I think, are going to just continue to be a tool of choice used by not only the U.S. government, but by foreign governments. And with that comes a level of debanking risk. And so, again, I think that's where governments need to kind of better understand and navigate the space of recognizing what the impact on different individuals will be when they are put in this position. But I think it's also important to note that when someone is put on the SDN list, it is because there's enough evidence to indicate that they're involved in either illicit finance or some type of relationship to something of national security priority and interest. It's not like the U.S. government's just designating people because they felt like it.
I see. So there's no effort to debank individuals or entities. What happens is they get placed on the sanctions list, and banks are very responsive to that kind of designation.
Yes, absolutely. And there are situations too where if someone has some level of connection to someone on the SDN list, then that can up their what's considered risk from a bank's perspective. So I'm also aware of situations where, just as an example, of Iranian Americans having a really hard time getting banked because of their last name, or if they had attempted to send, money back to their family in Iran. That may have been flagged as suspicious, and then, upon review by the compliance team in these different banks, the bank made a decision that they no longer wanted to work with that customer because they were considered too high risk.
So let's talk about sanctions sort of in the context of crypto, less from a how they're used perspective and more just like the effectiveness, right? So I think a lot of people in our space would say sanctions, one, are overused, but two, as industries like crypto grow, they're just going to become less effective because there's so many other ways to move money around the world. And you see this a bit, not just with crypto, but generally speaking, my understanding is that the sanctions against Russia over the last couple of years have been not as effective as intended for a number of reasons, including like the Russians are just finding other ways to get money out. So how do we think about the effectiveness of sanctions as a tool when you have a new industry like crypto? And what does Treasury do about that?
That's a really, really good question. The effectiveness of sanctions, and the overuse of sanctions in particular is something that Treasury has been really concerned about for a while. The overuse of sanctions goes all the way back to, Secretary Lew during the Obama administration, and his parting words cautioned against overusing this tool because the more we use it, there's the potential, the less effective it can be. And I think that's where we've also seen in the case of the Russia sanctions, as well as the Iran sanctions too, where you have these two regimes that just found different ways to move money. Because it's also important to remember that especially U.S. sanctions only apply to the U.S. jurisdiction, right? So it's the U.S. banks, it's the U.S. dollar. So that kind of leaves open a lot of other banks and currencies to work in, including crypto. And so, with the kind of onboarding of new innovation and technology and the different ways of moving money, I think we really have to be more strategic in how we use sanctions and what we're really going after. And in the crypto space, you've seen this a little bit with OFAC, where they've, I think, taken some pretty effective targeted actions when they've gone after individual wallets. Right. And they've frozen crypto wallets on different chains, and that's had an effect. And that's where you've also seen where, the crypto industry, I think, is working really closely with the government on some of these issues. And so hopefully those relationships will continue to increase. And that's where you can maybe get to a point where you can stop the activity without needing to sanction. In terms of the effectiveness of sanctions, again, it's one of the things that my team and I continue to kind of foot stomp, is that we need to do a better job of articulating the objectives of the sanctions when we put them together. Because, again, we've done a ton of research on the Russia sanctions and how effective they've been. And, we developed our own methodology for determining measures of effectiveness, because the U.S. and its partners never actually clearly stated what are these sanctions intended to do. So that's where I think it's incumbent on the U.S. government and OFAC in particular going forward, if we're going to use sanctions, or in the future if it's tariffs. I think we have to be really clear in identifying what are we trying to achieve with these tools, and then making sure that we have, the measures of effectiveness in place so that we understand when we've actually accomplished the goal, or be able to adjust if these tools aren't necessarily achieving that objective.
Is there a world where Treasury's objectives could actually be better achieved in more of a crypto context? One of the questions that came up as I was chatting with a friend about this episode was the TD Bank settlement last month, where TD Bank was fined $3 billion for its failure to effectively monitor drug cartel money laundering. To me, is an example of the fact that we have these really intensive regimes at major banks, and they're still not working. There's still a failure of compliance, and that there's a need to update the system. And you mentioned, Treasury working with folks in crypto to be able to designate significant, specific wallets. I think there's an instinct that we can build a better, more effective system. And I'm curious your take on that, and whether you think there's an opportunity there.
Absolutely. I mean, at least personally, I'm a big fan of crypto from the standpoint of just the traceability on the blockchain. It is an incredible tool, and I think it can really help single out and identify the actual illicit activity separate from just, run-of-the-mill transactions and individuals kind of running their daily lives. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity and promise with the innovation in this space. And it's something that, Treasury and law enforcement could really harness to better protect the financial system from abuse by illicit actors. And I think that's where you've also seen just like how effective it can be. Like when illicit actors, whether it's drug cartels or Russia or whatever, trying to use cryptocurrency, you can actually trace it back and you can find where it all started and who it's flowed to and stop that activity on the spot. So I think that there's a real opportunity here. I hope that, Treasury and, other regulators as well as law enforcement are able to better collaborate with this sector so that they can, work towards these issues together, and not have it come down to a situation where, Treasury is targeting entire protocols or platforms.
You mentioned that you actually worked at FinCEN in the last hours of the first Trump administration. And I want to dig in a little bit more on like what that was like and what you saw coming out of Treasury at that moment with regards to crypto.
Yes, it was a really interesting time in the crypto space because, this was right, again, around the time where Facebook was developing Libra. It was also, Secretary Mnuchin, former Secretary of Treasury, had really come out pretty strong in his remarks, saying that crypto posed a national security threat and that there were so many different illicit actors that were involved in this space. And there was different, legislation around that time too, around it. And so, there was a lot of stuff in the works trying to figure out how could this space be better regulated? What did it really mean? And then it was interesting if like none of that really moved anywhere. And then you had the Biden administration come in, and that's where, I think it's this weird disconnect, right? Like the Biden administration is saying like with Chokepoint 2.0, which isn't a real operation. It's kind of a colloquial term of trying to describe what is being perceived as happening in this space. But the Biden administration is kind of getting accused of kind of going really hard on crypto and trying to kind of cut this space out. But from my perspective, it really started in the first Trump administration. And there was a concerted effort to try to heavily regulate this space. And because it was deemed a national security threat.
What actually was happening in the first Trump administration to try to cut out the space?
So there was just a lot of what I can say. There's just a lot of regulation that was being considered and proposed and developed around this time too. There were different sanctions that were being rolled out and conversations in terms of what which should be targeted with financial tools to try to disrupt illicit actors being able to take advantage of the technology.
Okay, so we saw a bunch of things being considered at the end of the Trump administration, maybe the ramp up towards the end. There was the famous
midnight,
at least in my rules, like the midnight rulemaking on self-hosted wallets.
Yep.
And then the Biden administration, from your perspective, was almost a continuation of some of that action that we saw.
A continuation, but I think it was more of a kind of a reconsideration, right? So, at least from what I saw, is that the Biden administration, I think, felt the need to engage more with the sector to figure out, what's really needed in this space. Because from the community, we constantly heard that there needed to be regulatory clarity. And so I saw where, at least, from the FinCEN side, where they were starting to engage more with this sector to really understand the concerns and figure out some type of balance that addressed everyone's needs.
Who is that coming from? Because I'll say from the crypto side,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would say Biden was trying to engage us. Like, we didn't see it.
I think it was, there were some different executive orders and things like that where maybe I'm probably too much of a bureaucrat these days, where it's like, I saw this as like a good thing, but industry maybe is like, oh God, this is horrible. Where, the terminology like responsible innovation, where that was coming out, and the different executive orders that came down the pike, just trying to better set some different guardrails on to set the expectations of what like the government needed to see out of the innovation in the technology space, and trying to really get to a point where it was they used the terminology technology agnostic a lot. So when you're talking about,
What does that mean? Like, help us, help us
so
understand why that's good.
technology agnostic is basically a term to try to describe that it doesn't matter if it's crypto, if it's fiat currency, if it's, coins. It's, you're wanting to ensure from an AML-CFT standpoint, that's kind of my perspective, but this illicit finance and trying to protect this space, it doesn't matter if it's what technology it's running on. We have to make sure that there are sound AML-CFT guidelines and standards and protocols built into these systems to make sure that they can't be abused by illicit actors.
Right. So what you saw, because you were both in the first Trump administration and the Biden administration up until last year, I think you said, right? Was that the Biden administration was trying, at least at some point, to try to reset a relationship with the industry through things like the executive order. But it wasn't perceived as such. And some of the signals, like the term responsible innovation, which I'm hearing from you that that's supposed to be like forward-leaning language from the government. It was received with question marks at best from folks in industry.
So that's where it's like probably needs just some more communication, because I think we're like government and industry, like we're not speaking the same language. And then so when the government comes out with something like, oh, technology agnostic and responsible innovation, we think that like, hey, we got it. And then industry's like, what are you guys talking about? This is horrible. So I think that's kind of, it's funny. Like because from my perspective, it's like, this is a step forward in the right direction and progress, but industry may have interpreted it completely different.
Well, there's also, I think, folks, you're coming from the Treasury perspective. I think folks probably looked at the SEC and other agencies and saw some pretty different language.
Yeah, SEC's, I think, taken a more aggressive approach towards crypto.
Got it. And as we think about going into this coming year, I mean, you saw, I think, some pretty interesting contrast between what we saw from the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and some of the language on the campaign trail. How do you think that's going to change the posture towards the industry starting January 20th?
I think it's going to be really interesting to follow and be paying attention to, because again, I'm looking at it from the standpoint of in Trump's first administration, he was very anti-crypto, and they were taking steps to, really restrict how far this industry could come, to, advancements in the Biden administration where maybe I thought it was progress, but industry kind of feels otherwise. And now moving into the next Trump administration, and a lot of promises have been made to the crypto community on the campaign trail. And it's going to be kind of interesting to see how that really plays out. Because it's, I think important to note too that, the traditional financial sector is also kind of an ally with Trump on a lot of different issues. So he's going to have to figure out how to balance these two different communities that may have different objectives and goals. So I think it's worth paying attention to, but really, it's also going to be important. Like, I honestly don't think this is going to be a first 100 days issue, which I think, the crypto folks that I have been speaking to seem very optimistic that this is going to be kind of like one of the first things out of the bat because of what was said on the campaign trail. But, this entire space, it comes down to regulation, and the regulatory process is very slow and cumbersome, but that is on purpose because with regulation, the government needs to get it right. So there has to be room for public comment. And so I don't really anticipate anything really happening that will significantly affect this space in the first 100 days, on top of the fact that there are, multiple wars going on around the world and threat of tariffs every day, that I think it's just going to be interesting to see how much priority is placed on this space once he's actually in office.
So bureaucracy is going to stop change from happening super quickly.
I guess so, yeah.
That's a good note or question to start wrapping on, which is, I'm talking to you, Kim. You've spent years working on these issues, and you're someone who I think sees the opportunity in crypto. And I think a lot of people in crypto are looking at some of these actions coming out of Treasury saying, what is going on there? And they've lost a lot of trust. And I'm curious how you think the U.S. government and particularly Treasury should go about rebuilding trust with industry and creating that kind of constructive relationship that you're pointing towards, because it doesn't feel like it exists right now, or at least the attitude doesn't feel like it exists right now.
I think we're really at a critical point in this juncture, and I think it would honestly help Treasury if the crypto community could come together a little bit more. And figure out what they really want this space to look like. And then, it's incumbent on Treasury to be engaging more with this sector. I think, some work has been done, but there's always different, kind of sensitivities at play. But I think that just more public-private sector engagement and real conversations in this space can help everyone kind of find the right balance that works for the industry as well as the regulatory community that's ultimately trying to safeguard the financial system.
What do you mean when you say the crypto industry needs to come together and figure out what it wants for the space?
Well, because the crypto industry is it's very wide ranging, right? You got the stablecoin issuers, you have the regular Bitcoin blockchain style crypto space. And then you also have the anonymity enhanced crypto, right? And I think that within those different areas, there's different risk associated in how you use these tools. And so I know, the government's more concerned about the anonymity enhanced crypto than it is about, Ethereum or Bitcoin or a US stablecoin. Because that's just kind of a space that, the purpose of it is to be able to hide transactions. So I think if there's some level of agreement in terms across this entire space of what everybody's kind of looking for when it comes to regulation or how we're navigating through the stuff the government cares about, like AML, CFT, then maybe there's an opportunity for greater conversation and more kind of openness with the regulators in terms of how they're addressing these issues.
It's a great place to end. Kim, thanks so much.
Thanks, Amira.